Your place is there, you naughty girl. The cruel stepmother loses control and forces the special little girl to sleep in the doghouse. But minutes later, the millionaire father arrives unexpectedly at the mansion, and seeing the scene, he is shocked. In silence, he takes a step and takes an action that no one will ever forget. The biting chill of the pre-dawn air in the Palisades sliced Isabel's skin like ground glass. She held Leah's small, warm hand, feeling the child's stubborn resistance with every forced step onto the dew-soaked lawn. The odor of damp kibble coming from the feeder of Maximus, the family's golden retriever, mingled with the expensive perfume of the gardenias surrounding the mansion, creating a nauseating fragrance of opulence and neglect. For Isabel, however, the only smell that mattered was that of order being restored. The yogurt stain on the Persian rug, the shrill cry that had shattered the silence of her home office, the girl's refusal to put away her building blocks, all of it was chaos. And chaos was an enemy that had to be crushed with a firm hand. She saw herself not as a cruel stepmother, but as an architect of perfection, a woman who understood that a man like Richard, whose assets spanned hedge funds, real estate trusts, and crypto futures, required a home that mirrored his corporate life, impeccable, efficient, and above all, silent. Leah was no longer crying. Her sobs had transformed into a tremor that ran through her small body, a faint hum of fear and confusion. She didn't understand the logic of this punishment. The rug was just a thing. The noise was her voice, and the blocks were too colorful to be locked away in a box. Her bare feet sank into the wet earth, and the texture made her want to curl her toes, but Isabel's grip was a vice. Maximus's wooden doghouse emerged in the dim light, a canine sanctuary that was now to become a cell. "You will stay here until you learn to obey." Isabel's voice was low and controlled, without a hint of hesitation. She opened the latch and gently, but with irrefutable force, guided the girl inside. The scent of fur and cedar wrapped around Leah, who curled up in the farthest corner, hugging her knees. Isabel closed the door, leaving only darkness and the distant sound of a cat meowing at the moon. For an instant, the pride she had always used as a shield against her old fear of being discarded seemed to waver, but she fortified it. Discipline was a form of love, she repeated to herself, a necessary lesson to mold the child for the world that awaited her. Back in the warmth of the house, the silence was absolute. Isabel felt a wave of satisfaction. The universe was back on its axis. The baby, Theo, slept in his crib, monitored by the baby monitor in his room. The stain on the rug had already been cleaned by a staff member before she was dismissed early. Everything was in its proper place. It was then that the soft, electronic sound of the main gate opening cut through the quiet. The headlights of an expensive sedan swept across the marble facade of the house. Richard. He was arriving earlier than expected, probably exhausted after a day negotiating the future of his capital and the profitability of his investments. Isabel adjusted her posture, ready to greet him with the serenity he valued so much. But as he stepped out of the car, Richard didn't walk straight to the door. He paused, his head tilted, as if listening to something that didn't belong to the neighborhood's nocturnal symphony. A thin, almost imperceptible sound, a fragile, trembling children's melody. Coming from the backyard, he followed the song, his Italian loafers sinking into the same damp grass, and the image he found paralyzed him. His daughter huddled inside the doghouse, singing softly to the tiny receiver of the baby monitor, trying to soothe her little brother with the only tool she had, her voice. The marble entryway under Richard's feet when he finally turned toward the house seemed colder and more accusing than ever. He lifted his eyes and found Isabel standing at the door, the personification of order. His voice, when it finally came out, was not a shout, but a sentence of ice. "Have someone get her out of there. Now." He paused, the whole world contained in that second of silence. "Then go upstairs and pack your bags." The sentence hung in the air, denser and colder than the dawn itself. "Pack your bags." The words were not a blow, but a slow corrosion, dissolving the steel structure Isabel had built around herself. The old fear, the phobia of being discarded like an object that had lost its shine, emerged with overwhelming force. For a moment, she imagined her designer clothes, her shoes aligned by color, all packed into boxes, the material proof of her failure. But pride, her most faithful companion, prevented her from collapsing. She merely nodded, an almost imperceptible movement, and watched as one of the staff, summoned by a curt gesture from Richard, hurried to the yard and brought Leah inside, wrapped in a soft blanket. The girl did not look at her. That averted gaze hurt more than the order of expulsion. The conversation that followed was not in the master suite, but in the study, a room that smelled of leather and the weight of high finance. Richard, standing by the window overlooking the dark garden, did not actually tell her to leave right then. The sentence was more subtle and therefore more cruel. "You are not leaving this house right now, Isabel. I will not subject my children to any more instability," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But our marriage, the image we project, ended tonight. You will sleep in the guest room. Our interactions will be strictly about the children." He spoke as if dissolving a partnership, assessing emotional assets and liabilities and concluding that the damage was too great. For him, who had built a fortune with logical decisions in the stock market, love seemed to have become just another high-risk investment that had not yielded the expected return. The next morning was grey and silent. The mansion's hallways, previously just quiet, now echoed the emptiness. In the kitchen, a sweet and bitter smell of burnt caramel permeated the air. Isabel, who rarely ventured into that space, had tried to make a caramel custard, Leah's favorite dessert. It was meant to be a gesture of peace, a clumsy attempt to rebuild a bridge with sugar and eggs. But, distracted by the anxiety gnawing at her stomach, she let the caramel overcook, turning it into a dark, bitter paste. The custard, pale and imperfect, sat untouched on the marble counter. Richard passed by, picked up an apple, saw the failed dessert, and said nothing. His silence was a condemnation. The intervention came in the form of a phone call. The exclusive private school, a hugely expensive institution that was just another asset Richard's money could buy, called. A teacher with a carefully neutral voice reported that Leah was apathetic, refusing to participate in sensory activities. They suggested, with the firmness the tuition value allowed, a visit from an occupational therapist, OT, for an in-home evaluation. Richard agreed immediately, outsourcing the solution once again. He communicated the decision to Isabel as a fait accompli. "She is coming tomorrow, and you will attend every session. You will learn what is necessary." The order placed her in the position of a student, of an incompetent. It was a calculated humiliation. The next day, promptly at 10 in the morning, the doorbell rang. Isabel took a deep breath, straightened her back, and composed a mask of serene cooperation on her face. She opened the imposing solid wood door, ready to face this new challenge. Standing in the doorway was a woman with a gentle smile and perceptive eyes, carrying a canvas bag full of colorful objects. And in that instant, the floor seemed to disappear beneath Isabel's feet. The air grew thin and the blood froze in her veins. She knew that face. It was the same professional whom, months earlier, she had arrogantly dismissed after a single session, with the excuse that her approach didn't match the family's image. The therapist, for her part, recognized her. Her smile did not waver, but her eyes gained a new depth, a mix of professionalism and a clear memory of the previous rejection. Shame was a wave of heat that rose up Isabel's neck and settled on her face. There stood Clara, the therapist, a ghost of her past decisions, Standing at her door with the same professional calm she had despised, the world seemed to shrink, reducing itself to that entryway and the abyss between the woman she was and the woman she needed to pretend to be. With monumental effort, she forced a tight smile and stepped aside. "Welcome," she said, her voice sounding like a stranger's. Clara entered, her gaze sweeping the room with an assessment that was not of decor, but of dynamics. She did not mention the previous encounter. That silence was a form of power, and Isabel, for the first time in a long time, felt completely disarmed. The session was a silent torture. Clara unpacked objects of varied textures, simple picture cards, and a small timer from her bag. She did not address Isabel as a culprit, but as part of an equation to be solved. "Leah needs predictability," Clara explained, her voice soft but firm, as she set up a small visual routine chart on the coffee table. "The world bombards her with sensory information. Our job is to create a filter, a safe path for her to follow." Every word was a stab at Isabel's perfectionism, who had always believed that discipline was imposed, not built. Richard watched everything from a distant armchair, like an investor analyzing the performance of a new asset. He did not intervene, but his presence was a constant audit. Later that night, Isabel heard him in Leah's room. The door was ajar, and she saw him kneel beside the bed, adjust the blanket, and whisper with a choked voice she had never heard, "Never outside again, my daughter. Daddy promises, never again." That weekend, following Clara's suggestion to explore rich environments in a controlled way, they went to the Westwood Village Artisan Market. The place was an explosion of colors, sounds, and smells, the opposite of the mansion's sterile environment. Isabel felt the panic rising. It was the perfect setting for one of Leah's sensory crises. But, to her surprise, the girl, holding her father's hand, seemed mesmerized. Her big eyes followed the colorful threads of Bohemian tapestries, the scent of grilled corn and street food, the textures of handmade pottery. It was then that she stopped in front of a stall selling simple rag dolls. There were dozens of them, with yarn hair and simple cotton dresses. Leah pointed to one, the simplest of all. Isabel watched the scene, feeling like a spectator of her own life. And then, something inside her moved, an impulse. She approached the stall, picked up a tiny outfit that was in a basket nearby, a little dress with a delicate red ribbon, and bought it. On the way back to the car, while Richard paid for parking, Isabel knelt down in front of Leah and handed her the small dress. "For your doll," she said, her voice low. Leah took the fabric, felt its softness, and looked up at Isabel. There was no smile, but something deeper. She took a step forward and leaned her shoulder against Isabel's arm. It lasted only a second, maybe two, a light, almost accidental contact, but one that carried the weight of a universe. The warmth of that small gesture spread through Isabel's body, a sensation so strange and overwhelming that it left her breathless. For the first time, she did not feel judged, just felt. Later, back at home, as she watched the sun set and paint the sky orange, the house gardener, a discreet man named Hector, approached her with hesitation. He wrung his cap in his hands, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Mrs. Isabel, I apologize. I don't know if I should interfere," he began, his voice low and concerned. "But the night of that commotion, I heard a strange audio coming from the neighbor's phone. Mrs. Vivian. It sounded like she was instructing someone." Hector's words fell like stones on the calm, artificial surface Isabel tried to maintain. "A strange audio," she repeated, her voice sharper than she intended. The image of Vivian, her neighbor across the hedge, arose in her mind, always impeccable, with a smile that never reached her eyes and a predatory curiosity about other people's lives. Vivian, the HOA president, the organizer of charity events, the woman who seemed to have turned neighborhood life into her personal chessboard. The idea of her instructing someone on the night of the incident was absurd and, at the same time, terribly plausible. "What did you hear, Hector?" Isabel asked, trying to maintain her composure. The gardener hesitated, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "I didn't hear it clearly, ma'am. The sound was low, but the voice was hers, and it sounded angry. She was talking about giving a reality check, setting real boundaries." He flinched, as if the words themselves accused him. "I didn't want to interfere. You know how it is. Around here we don't talk about the boss or the boss's neighbor." The seed of suspicion was planted. Isabel spent the rest of the day replaying fragmented conversations with Vivian, the comments disguised as advice, the casual questions about Leah's adjustment. Could she, with her poisonous insinuations, have pushed her toward that extreme gesture? The guilt, which was entirely hers to bear, now seemed to have an echo, an external source that somehow made it even more unbearable. Had she been manipulated? Or was she just looking for a way to dilute her own responsibility? The uncertainty gnawed at her. That night, the silence in the guest room was torture. Without Richard's presence, the space seemed vast and empty. Driven by a restlessness that wouldn't let her sleep, she went to the study. She was looking for something, anything, to distract her mind. It was then that, upon opening a drawer in Richard's desk that was always locked, she found it, a box of dark wood. Inside, among old documents and photos, was a single letter written in elegant, slightly slanted handwriting. It was from Anna, Richard's first wife, Leah's mother, who had left not due to fate, but by choice, leaving her daughter in her father's care. The letter, dated shortly before her departure, was not for Richard but for Leah. The words were a testament of love and a plea. "My little star," the letter began. "May you grow up surrounded not by those who tolerate you, but by those who learn from you as much as they teach you. May your sensitivity not be seen as a weakness, but as the superpower it is." Isabel felt the air leave her lungs. Every sentence was a mirror reflecting her own failures. She had never tried to learn from Leah. She had tried to mold her, to correct her. The next morning, she left the letter on Richard's desk, where he couldn't ignore it. She watched from the door as he read it. She saw the rigidity in his shoulders yield, the mask of the multimillionaire CEO break for an instant, revealing the man beneath, a father whose guilt now took a new form. It was no longer just the vague guilt of absence, but the concrete responsibility to fulfill Anna's wish. He raised his eyes and stared at her. There was no forgiveness in his look, but there was a change. The dynamic between them had shifted. He no longer saw her just as the aggressor, but as part of a much larger failure, a failure that was also his. And in that shared territory of error, something new and fragile might, perhaps, begin to grow. Anna's letter, left on the desk, was not mentioned, but its presence altered the atmosphere of the house. Richard began to observe more. His looks were not accusatory, but a cold, distant evaluation, like an investment analyst re-evaluating a risky asset in his portfolio. Isabel, in turn, clung to Clara's guidance with the tenacity of someone drowning. She immersed herself in the new universe of visual routines, noise-cancelling headphones, and positive reinforcement. On Tuesday, she achieved a small miracle. Using the picture cards, she anticipated the transition from bath to dinner without a single tear from Leah. The girl even helped her stick a star sticker on the routine chart. In that small gesture, sticking the crooked sticker, Isabel felt a spark of hope, the possibility that the vast equity of errors she had accumulated could, somehow, be renegotiated. Hope, however, is a volatile commodity. On Wednesday, the phone rang. It was the school director. The voice, on the other end of the line, was a cocktail of forced politeness and contained indignation. "Mrs. Isabel, We received a call from a mother, Mrs. Vivian, who is very concerned, the director began, and Isabel felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She informed us of your desire to transfer Leah to a less demanding institution. She suggested that you were embarrassed by her development. The accusation was absurd, a poisonous distortion. Isabel opened her mouth to deny, to defend herself, but the words died before they were born. Because, beneath the lie, there was a toxic grain of truth. She had called the school secretary. The confrontation with Richard happened that night, in the same study where their marriage had been sentenced. He didn't yell. His voice was low, controlled, which made it even more cutting. "The director called me," he said, getting straight to the point. "Explain." Isabel trembled, her hands cold. "It's not true, Richard. I never said I was embarrassed by her." "Then why did you call the school asking for transfer information the day after that incident at the market?" he pressed, each word a nail in her coffin. The truth, naked and ugly, had to come out. "There was a crisis," she whispered, her voice choked. "On the way back from the market, Leah got overwhelmed. She screamed in the car. I panicked. I thought I couldn't handle it, that she needed a more controlled place. It was a stupid impulse. I hung up in less than a minute. I never formalized anything." He listened in silence, his face a stone mask. For a man accustomed to analyzing the cash flow of multi-million-dollar businesses, her logic was unacceptable. He didn't see the panic of an overwhelmed woman. He saw the confirmation of his greatest fear. He saw the same woman who had dismissed the best therapist out of vanity, now trying to hide her daughter out of shame. The fragile bridge that Anna's letter had built between them collapsed. "I need to travel," he announced, his voice icy. "I have an unavoidable meeting in New York to finalize the sale of part of the company. I'm taking the children with me. The nanny will go too." The pause he made was loaded with meaning. "While I'm gone, I suggest you start organizing the boxes in the storage room. We need more space." The order was trivial, but the message was clear. She was no longer the lady of the house, but a curator of his clutter. He was giving her a chore to keep her busy, while he removed her, along with the children, from the equation of his life. The sound of Richard's car engine fading away was muffled by the soft electronic closing of the gate, and then silence. It was not the ordered, quiet Isabel so cherished, but an immense, heavy vacuum that settled in every room, in every hallway. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the living room, which she had never noticed before, now sounded like a countdown to the end of her life in that house. The hum of the brushed steel refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant murmur of the air conditioning system, each noise was proof of human absence. The mansion, once a symbol of her success, of her ascent, had transformed into a gilded, empty prison. The task Richard had given her, organizing the storage boxes, was a veiled insult, a way of saying she was as disposable as the objects that were no longer useful. The silence remaining in the house was not peace, it was the echo of her own failure. With her shoulders bowed under an invisible weight, she descended the stairs leading to the storage room. The air there was cold and smelled of dust and stored memories. The boxes were stacked against a wall, labeled in her precise handwriting from years ago. Portfolios, awards, initial projects. She opened the first one. Inside, leather binders held impeccable presentations from her old work as an image consultant. There were photos of executives she had transformed, of celebrities whose shine she had polished, of politicians whose image she had built. Here was proof that she had once been a woman whose capital was her intelligence, her assets, her reputation. She remembered the pride she felt closing a big deal, the satisfaction of seeing her strategies generate profit and recognition for her clients. She had traded all of that, her own fortune of talents, for the security of Richard's dollars. for the easy life financed by dividends and investments in funds she barely understood, sitting on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the ghosts of who she used to be. Isabel felt the tears she had been holding back finally fall. She cried silently, a mourning for herself. That was how Maria, the cook, found her. The woman, who usually moved through the house with an almost invisible discretion, stopped at the door, holding a steaming cup of tea. She said nothing about the tears, asked no questions. She simply approached, placed the cup beside Isabel, and said, with the gentle voice of someone who understands unnamed sorrows, "The silence sometimes screams, doesn't it, Mrs. Isabel? I made you some chamomile tea." That simple gesture, that small offering of human warmth, broke something inside Isabel. She thanked her with a nod, unable to speak. Maria had already withdrawn when Isabel's cell phone, forgotten atop one of the boxes, began to vibrate. Richard's name flashed on the screen. Her heart pounded. Was it to give another order? To make sure the humiliation was being carried out? She answered, her hand trembling. "Isabel." His voice on the other end was not cold or distant. It was tense, sharpened by urgency. Something unexpected happened. She held her breath. "Leah has a fever, a high fever. We gave her the medicine, but it's not coming down. The doctor here recommended we return. We're at the airport. We'll arrive around midnight." They arrived in a wave of contained panic and exhaustion. Richard carried Leah in his arms, the girl's body limp and feverish against his chest. The nanny, her face pale with worry, brought Theo, who was whimpering, feeling the tension in the air. The mansion, once a mausoleum of silence, suddenly filled with a chaotic, frightened energy. Isabel stood at the top of the stairs, an invisible spectator. Richard did not see her, or pretended not to. He acted like the executive he was, giving orders on the phone to the most expensive pediatrician in the city, demanding an immediate house call, regardless of the hour. All his immense fortune, the wealth that gave him access to anything, was now channeled into a single objective: buying his daughter's health. But the fever did not negotiate. The night dragged on, long and agonizing. The doctor came, examined the girl, medicated her, and gave the usual instructions: lukewarm baths, hydration, vigilance. But the temperature stubbornly refused to yield. Leah, lying in bed, alternated between restless sleep and low moans, her skin burning to the touch. She rejected everything: the water, her father's touch, the damp cloth on her forehead. Her glazed eyes seemed to look through people, lost in a discomfort that no amount of money could reach. Richard, the man who commanded meetings and decided the fate of millions of dollars with a phone call, was completely impotent. He paced back and forth in the room, frustration and fear etched on his face. All his ability to manage assets and liabilities, to calculate risks and profits, was useless against the cells of a child's body in revolt. Isabel watched from the doorway, her heart tight. She should have felt satisfied with his helplessness, but she felt nothing but an anguish that echoed the girl's. Seeing Leah so fragile, so vulnerable, awakened an instinct in her that she didn't know she possessed. It was no longer about winning back a place in that family, proving her worth, or erasing her mistakes. It was about the feverish heat emanating from that small body, about the primal need to offer some kind of relief. It was then that a fragmented memory came to mind, an old conversation with Richard at the beginning of their dating, where he had mentioned a song Anna used to sing. With her heart beating fast, she retrieved her cell phone. Desperate, she started searching old files, conversation backups, anywhere she might find a trace of that melody. And there it was, a tiny audio file sent by Richard years ago, captioned, "Her Magic Song." It was an appropriation of the sacred, an invasion, but she didn't care. She entered the room. Richard, defeated, was sitting in an armchair, his head in his hands. Isabel approached the bed, her breath caught in her throat. She played the audio at the lowest volume. Anna's voice, a recorded whisper, filled the silence. It was a simple, sweet, melancholy lullaby. Leah, who was weakly thrashing, stopped. Isabel then did the bravest thing she had ever done. She began to hum along, her voice trembling and slightly off-key, following the ghostly melody. The girl's breathing began to deepen, finding the rhythm of the song. Her muscles, previously tense, relaxed. She turned her head on the pillow, her still feverish eyes focusing on Isabel. And then, slowly, Leah's small, warm hand emerged from beneath the blanket. It did not move toward her father, but toward her. It crossed the small space between them, a slow and deliberate gesture, a fragile bridge suspended in the air, heavy with sickness and silence. Maria, the cook, who had brought a glass of water, paused at the door, witnessing the impossible, holding her breath as the small hand continued its journey, seeking the hand of the woman who had exiled her to the cold. The touch was light as a feather, but to Isabel it weighed like an anchor. Leah's small hand, warm and slightly damp with fever, found hers. Hesitantly, Isabel intertwined her fingers with the girl's. In that contact, an invisible barrier dissolved. It was not forgiveness. It was something more primal. Need. The girl, in her absolute vulnerability, had not sought her father, the provider of all fortune and material security, but the source of her greatest pain. Richard watched the scene, paralyzed. His vast wealth, his investments spanning continents, his entire empire built on logic and coldness, shrank to nothing before that gesture. He, the man who could move markets with a single command, could not move his own daughter's hand toward him. The real power in that silent room was not in bank accounts filled with dollars and euros, but in the fragile melody of a lullaby and in a touch of skin against skin. Isabel did not leave the bedside. The night became a silent vigil. She continued to hum the melody, her voice low and constant, a thread of sound that seemed to weave a safety net around the girl. Every hour she felt Leah's forehead, noticing the gradual, almost imperceptible decrease in heat. The child's breathing became more rhythmic, deeper. She fell asleep holding Isabel's hand, a fragile grip, but one that kept her there, chained by a new kind of responsibility. Maria, the cook, saw everything from the door before withdrawing. Moments later, Richard's phone, forgotten on the dresser, vibrated discreetly. He picked it up. A short message from Maria. She stayed all night, didn't leave her side for a minute. He read the message, looked at the wife he had condemned to exile, and for the first time since that terrible night, he truly saw her. Not the cold, calculating woman, but someone who, out of fear or an instinct she didn't even understand, had chosen to stay. When the first rays of sun broke through the blinds, the fever had broken. Leah slept a peaceful sleep, her face serene, her breathing regular. Isabel, exhausted, felt the muscles in her neck ache. She gently loosened her hand from Leah's, who did not stir. As she stood up, her eyes met Richard's, who had spent the night in the armchair. Watching her, there was a deep exhaustion on his face, but also something more, a crack in his armor of certainty. He looked like a man who had reevaluated the value of all his assets and discovered that the most precious asset in his life was intangible and on the verge of failure. He stood up and walked toward her. The space between them was charged with unspoken words. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. The words sounded strange, inadequate for the immensity of what had happened. Isabel merely nodded. She turned to leave, to return to her cell in the guest room, assuming the truce had ended with the fever. But his voice stopped her at the door. "Isabel." She turned around. His gaze was serious, indecipherable. "Don't go back to the guest room tonight," he said, not as an invitation, but as a realization. "Stay here, on the sofa. We need to keep an eye on her." The order was practical, But the subtext was an earthquake. He was including her back in the circle of care, a circle that, until the night before, seemed permanently closed to her. The truce, imposed by the fever, was fragile as glass. Isabel spent the night on the small sofa in Leah's room, a neutral territory between her exile and the reconquered space. She slept fitfully, waking at every breath the girl took. Richard remained in the armchair. They did not talk, but the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of hostility, but that of two watchmen sharing a shift, united by a common purpose. The house, which had once been a minefield of painful memories, transformed into a makeshift hospital where the only things that mattered were the temperature, hydration, and the child's gentle breathing. With Leah's improvement, Clara, the therapist, returned. She asked no questions about what had happened, but her perceptive eyes noticed the change in dynamics. The guest room door was open and the bed untouched. Richard no longer absented himself for meetings. His presence became a constant, though still distant. Clara seized the moment of family vulnerability to introduce her most powerful tool, the visual routine chart. This time, it was not just a suggestion, but a firm implementation. She sat on the floor with Isabel, Richard, and a still pale Leah, and together they assembled the chart. Simple figures for waking up, eating, playing, therapy, and sleeping. The genius was in the rewards. Star stickers, 5 minutes of rest with the noise-cancelling headphones, a warm bath with the soft sponge Leah loved. The tools, which had previously seemed strange and clinical, now gained a new meaning. They were steps, small and safe, to lift Leah out of the abyss of sensory disorganization and bring peace back to the house. As the routine began to establish itself, the outside world, with its own business and intrigues, tried to invade that bubble. Richard's phone wouldn't stop ringing. They were calls about the company sale, about the audit that was underway. With each call, he seemed more irritated, more divided between the urgency of his business empire and the silent urgency of his family. One afternoon, Isabel heard him arguing on the phone in the study. "I don't care about the return on equity. I want the final report done," he said, his voice tense. "The audit is dragging, and it's costing me not just money, but time. Time I don't have." The audit was being conducted by a firm recommended by Vivian, the neighbor. She called almost every day, under the pretext of asking about Leah's health. But her questions always diverted to the company sale, to the stress Richard must be feeling. "Anything you need, dear. Just call," she said with a honeyed voice that made Isabel's skin crawl. Hector's mention of the audio constantly returned to Isabel's mind, an uncomfortable suspicion she didn't know how to confirm. She felt trapped between the need to rebuild Richard's trust and the fear of seeming like she was just trying to shift the blame to someone else, inventing conspiracies. The threat no longer came from within, from Leah's fever or sensory chaos, but from outside. A threat disguised as friendship, weaving a web around them, tightening financial and emotional knots, and Isabel knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this web was about to close. The routine, with its predictable cadence, began to work its silent magic. Mornings were no longer battlegrounds, but a sequence of steps choreographed by colored cards. On a sunny Saturday, following another suggestion from Clara, they went to Central Park, or a large local park. It was a test. A crowd, sounds of children, the smell of popcorn in the air, a potential sensory nightmare. But, equipped with her noise-cancelling headphones and the predictability of the routine chart they carried on a clipboard, Leah was radiant. Richard bought a bottle of bubble solution and, for the first time in months, Isabel saw him smile without the shadow of worry. A genuine smile, triggered by the sight of Leah running awkwardly across the grass, trying to catch the iridescent spheres floating against the blue New York sky, adjusting context for a major US city vibe. For a moment, they were not a multimillionaire executive, and his disgraced wife. They were just a father and mother, seeing their daughter happy. In that moment of peace, as a soap bubble landed on Isabel's hand and popped, she felt that perhaps the most important net worth they could build together was not measured in dollars, but in moments like that. The bubble of peace burst the moment they arrived home. Vivian's car was parked across the street, and she was walking toward their gate with a rehearsed urgency. "Richard, darling, so glad I caught you," she said, her voice heavy with false concern. "I didn't want to alarm you, but a friend of mine who works on the audit team confided something to me. I'm so worried about you." Richard stiffened. Isabel, who was helping Leah out of the car, felt a chill. Vivian lowered her voice, making the conversation a poisonous secret. "It seems there are some inconsistencies in the asset reports. Nothing serious, of course, but it might delay the sale, perhaps even affect the final valuation. I know how crucial the profitability of this deal is to the children's future, to their inheritance. I thought you should know before the news spreads." That was enough. Richard thanked Vivian for her friendship with a curt nod and went inside, transformed. The father from the park disappeared, replaced by the cornered CEO. He locked himself in the study, and the sound of his voice on the phone, harsh and impatient, echoed through the hallways again. The fragile connection they had built disintegrated. Isabel knew, with a certainty that hurt her soul, that this was Vivian's doing. The pain of being pushed out again propelled her. She could no longer be passive. Late that afternoon, she found Hector tending to the lavender near the doghouse. "Hector," she began, her voice firm but low. "The audio you heard, was it from Mrs. Vivian's fancy cell phone?" The gardener looked around nervously. "No, ma'am. It was from an old, beat-up phone she keeps in the tool shed for emergencies. Sometimes the record button gets pressed in the pocket. Old phone thing." The information was a key. Small, rusty, but a key. Isabel felt a rush of adrenaline. There was a chance, a small chance, to prove the manipulation. But her hope was crushed that night. Richard emerged from the study, his eyes red with fatigue and stress. He stopped her in the hallway, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Isabel, the problems in the audit are real. This deal is my children's future. It is the capital that will ensure they have everything. I need absolute focus and zero distractions." He paused, and his next words hit her like a physical blow. "I appreciate what you did for Leah, but I need you to understand. Stay out of my business. And please, for now, stay out of my way. Stay out of my way." Richard's phrase was a door slamming in Isabel's face, locking her out once again. The mansion's hallway, which for a few days had seemed like a path back, now stretched like an endless exile. She retreated, step by step, to the guest room door. The neatly made bed, which had remained untouched, seemed to mock her, a reminder that her presence at the center of the family was only temporary, an emergency concession that had expired along with Leah's fever. The pain of rejection was sharp, familiar. It was the echo of all her fears, the confirmation that she was, in the end, disposable. For a moment, the urge to curl up in that bed and disappear was overwhelming, but then, the image of Leah running after the soap bubbles, her face lit up by pure joy, flashed in her mind. That moment was real. The small hand holding hers in the feverish dawn was real. That was equity she was not willing to liquidate. A new determination, forged in humiliation and newfound affection, stiffened her spine. Vivian would not destroy this. She would not use Richard's anxiety about his business, about protecting his fortune and his children's inheritance, to poison the fragile peace they had begun to build. She was no longer fighting just for her marriage, but for that girl. She waited for night to fall, a cloak of darkness that would give her the cover she needed. From the window, she watched the lights of Vivian's house go out, one by one. The neighborhood was submerged in the silence of the rich, a silence that hid so many things. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she slipped out the back door. The cold, damp grass beneath her bare feet was a shock, a reminder of another terrible night. But now her steps had purpose. The tool shed was in the back of the garden, near the hedge separating their property from Vivian's. The wooden door creaked, a sound too loud in the stillness of the night. Isabel held her breath, waiting, but nothing happened. Inside, the smell of damp earth and machine oil was strong. Using her cell phone flashlight, she searched, and there it was. On a dusty shelf, an old, scratched cell phone. The battery indicator was flashing red, dangerously low. With trembling fingers, she turned it on. The screen took an eternity to light up. She navigated the primitive menus, her heart in her throat. Files, recordings. There were several, most of them unintelligible noises, but one had the date of the week of the incident. The file was small. She pressed play. The static filled the small space. First, Vivian's voice, unmistakable, honeyed and cutting. "You are a smart woman, Isabel. You know a man like Richard, with the capital he manages, needs order. He cannot have the cash flow of his personal life interrupted by crises and tantrums." There was a pause, and then Isabel's voice sounded hesitant, full of anxiety. "But I don't know what to do. She won't listen to me." And then came the poison, the explicit manipulation. The phrase Hector had heard fragmented. "Darling." "Sometimes a child like her," Vivian's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, "needs a shock, a firm gesture to understand boundaries. It's not cruelty, it's a strategic application. Think of it as a short-term investment with high returns for your family's peace." Isabel stopped the recording, her hand shaking so hard she almost dropped the device. The proof was there. Vivian hadn't just spread a rumor. She had planted the sick seed in her mind, using Isabel's greatest fears as fertile ground. But the recording was a double-edged sword. How could she show it to Richard, a man who had told her to stay out of his way, without him hearing in those words only the confession of her own terrible weakness? The recording on the old cell phone burned in Isabel's drawer, like a hot coal. It was the proof that could absolve her of malice, but also the irrefutable proof of her weakness, of how easily she had been manipulated. Showing it to Richard now, while he was drowning in the pressures of the audit, might be interpreted as a desperate act of self-preservation, not a search for truth. And so she kept her secret, feeling its weight with every breath as the night of the launch cocktail at the Crystal Pavilion approached. The event, sponsored by one of the investment funds interested in buying Richard's company, was crucial. For him, it was the showcase of his success. For Vivian, it would be the stage for her triumph. The Crystal Pavilion floated in the city night, a jewel of architecture and power. Inside, the air was thin, dense with expensive perfume and conversations that measured net worth in whispers. Isabel stood beside Richard, playing the trophy wife role he had requested, a frozen smile on her face. Vivian moved through the hall like a queen on her board, spreading charm and poison in equal doses. Isabel watched her, seeing her approach one of the main sponsors, a man whose support was vital to sealing the deal with the expected profitability. She saw the conversation, the smiles, the worried nod of the man. Minutes later, Richard's assistant approached him, his face pale. "Sir, Mr. Almeida is pulling back. He said he doesn't feel comfortable associating his assets with a company involved in neighborhood intrigues that affect business image." The blow was precise, surgical. Richard looked across the hall and saw Vivian give him a look of false compassion. In that instant, he understood. The drawn-out audit, the inconsistencies, the sponsor pulling back. It was a trap, an attempt to devalue his business so that she, or someone connected to her, could benefit, or simply to isolate him and have him under her control. While cold, controlled fury hardened his features, something improbable happened. Hector, the gardener, appeared at the service entrance to the patio, wringing his cap in his hands, refusing to leave until he spoke to the boss. Intrigued, Richard went to him. Hector, his voice low and urgent, simply held out the old cell phone. "You need to hear this, boss. I couldn't let it stand." On the patio, with the noise of the party muffled by the glass, Richard pressed play. The wind carried the smell of imminent rain and the basil from the planter below, and he listened. The billionaire's mask dissolved, replaced by that of a man who saw, for the first time, the complete architecture of betrayal. He did not return to the party. He went straight home. He found Isabel in Leah's room, adjusting the blanket of the sleeping girl. He did not accuse her. He simply held out the cell phone and pressed play again. She heard her own voice, weak and desperate, and Vivian's voice, the serpent's. When the audio ended, the silence was total. "Why didn't you show me this?" he asked, his voice rough. The tears Isabel had been holding back finally fell. "Because I was afraid," she whispered. The naked truth, afraid that you would only hear my failure. My dread of being discarded, of not being perfect for you, is so great that it transformed me into this, a hard woman who confuses discipline with cruelty. What happened next surprised her. He took a step forward, and for the first time, his own mask fell. "And my fear," he said, his voice breaking, "the fear of not being enough as a father, of not knowing how to be present, turned me into an ATM. I bought convenience, outsourced affection, used my money not to have to look at my own absence. We both failed her, Isabel." Thunder broke the sky outside, and inside that room, the walls separating them finally crumbled. The mutual confession, wrapped in the storm raging outside, was not an absolution, but a sharing. For the first time, they were not on opposite sides of a domestic courtroom, but together in the same defendant's box, acknowledging their own crimes of omission and fear. The conversation stretched through the night, punctuated by the sound of rain and Leah's peaceful breathing in the next room. They did not talk about business, stocks, or dividends, but about the emotional deficit of their family. Isabel spoke of her terror of abandonment, an inheritance from her own childhood that led her to build a fortress of perfectionism. Richard admitted that he had hidden behind the excuse of providing for the future, using the expansion of his fortune as a shield so he wouldn't have to deal with the complexities of the present. It was an audit of the soul, painful and necessary. The next morning, the world seemed washed by the rain and the truth. Richard made his first decision not as a CEO, but as a father. He called his partners and, with a calm and irreducible voice, suspended the negotiations for the sale of the company. "There has been a reassessment of our most important assets," he said, and Isabel knew he was not talking about capital. "We are implementing a new management policy, starting at the top, more flexible schedules, more presence at home. Long-term profitability depends on the sustainability of our foundations." The decision shocked the market and would certainly represent financial losses. But for the first time, Richard seemed to be making an investment whose return would not be measured in euros or dollars. Meanwhile, Isabel made her own call. It was to Clara, the therapist. "Clara, I had an idea," she said, her voice vibrating with a new energy. "My job has always been about building images, but now I want to build routines. I want to use what I know about strategy and organization to help other families." The proposal was audacious, an atelier, or consultancy, for sensory consultation, uniting Clara's clinical expertise with Isabel's strategic vision. They wouldn't sell glamour, but tools for domestic peace. Clara, on the other end of the line, was silent for an instant, and then laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I would love that, Isabel. I think you are finally finding your true net worth." The resolution with Vivian did not happen in court, but on the social stage she valued so much. The annual HOA Summer Gala was her crown event. That night, the air smelled of grilled corn, and the festive chatter filled the ballroom. Vivian, believing that Richard's withdrawal from the company sale was a sign of weakness, decided to deliver her final blow. In the middle of the prize drawing, she grabbed the microphone. "And now, a special thanks to our neighbor Isabel," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "who has taught us so much about alternative methods of child discipline. Perhaps she can give us a lecture next year." The hall fell silent. The embarrassment was palpable. The humiliation was served live. Isabel felt the blood drain from her face. But before she could react, something happened. Leah, who was sitting at a table with her star sticker-covered noise-cancelling headphones, stood up. She did not cry, she did not scream. With the rag doll with the little red ribbon dress clutched to her chest, she crossed the floor, her gaze fixed on Isabel. Every step was deliberate. The entire hall held its breath. She stopped in front of Isabel, who was paralyzed. Then, the girl gently pulled on the hem of her stepmother's dress and, with a clear gesture that the whole world could understand, leaned her head against Isabel's leg, saying without words, "Stay with me." Justice, after all, did not need a judge, just a rag doll and a gesture of love. Leah's gesture, so small and yet so immense, silenced the music, the whispers, the entire hall. Vivian was paralyzed, the microphone in her hand, her face a mask of disbelief. The humiliation she had planned with the precision of a stock market attack ricocheted and hit her squarely. Richard then moved. He did not run, he did not shout. He walked slowly to Isabel and Leah and placed one hand on his wife's shoulder and the other gently on his daughter's head. He looked not at Vivian but at the silent audience, the neighbors who were the spectators of that social arena. His voice, when he spoke, was not that of the billionaire executive, but that of a father who finally understood the true meaning of wealth. "This," he said, his voice firm and clear, echoing in the silence, "is our home, and this is our family." The sentence was simple, but the meaning was absolute. He had drawn a line, not with money or power, but with loyalty. The hall, which judged in whispers, now saw in gestures. Vivian's reputation, her most precious asset, evaporated that night, and the sponsorships for her future events withered like unwatered flowers. In the following weeks, the transformation ceased to be a promise and became a habit. The doghouse, the somber monument to Isabel's mistake, was dismantled, board by board. In its place, with Hector's help, they planted a bed of lavender, whose perfume now filled the house in the late afternoons, an aroma of peace, where there had once been the smell of punishment. Leah slept in her own room, supported by the visible routine chart posted on the wall. Simple figures, predictable schedules, fulfilled promises. Breakfasts no longer involved cell phones, only the sound of Leah's spoon hitting her plate and conversations about the day's plans. Visits to the park with soap bubbles became a sacred ritual. Every small gesture was a deposit into a new account, one that did not yield financial interest, but a kind of security that no cash inheritance could buy. Isabel and Clara opened the doors of the Connection Atelier, or the Connection Consultancy. The success was immediate and quiet. Mothers and fathers, many of them neighbors from the same community, arrived with shoulders heavy with guilt and left with practical tools and a little more hope. Isabel, who once sold the image of perfection, now sold the permission to be imperfect and the strategy to find peace in chaos. She closed her glamorous contracts and discovered that the profit of seeing a child manage to tie their shoes for the first time was infinitely greater than any commission. Richard, in turn, established a new post-nuptial agreement with her, a document that did not discuss the division of assets, but the sharing of responsibilities, placing Leah's well-being as the main asset to be protected. He abandoned the sale of the company, absorbed the losses, and gained Tuesday afternoons to take his daughter to therapy. On a spring night, sitting on the porch while Leah slept, Richard held Isabel's hand. The air smelled of lavender and damp earth. There was no easy forgiveness, because forgiveness was not an event, but a process, a daily choice.